All right, well, we will go ahead and get started, and other folks can catch up as they're able to. So, hi everyone. I'm Todd Tucker. I direct the industrial policy and trade work for the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm very excited for today's conversation with Jessica Green. As we've said in some of the promotional materials for this conversation, climate policy is often debated in a technocratic bubble, obscuring the power dynamics that are really behind some of the key decisions and whether the fossil economy is evitable or inevitable. And I think Jessica's new book from Princeton University Press, Existential Politics, really moves this conversation forward by centering political economy in the conversation about what to do about climate change and what approaches radical pragmatists are the best to move us forward. I'll give a short bio here. Jessica is professor of political science at the University of Toronto, with cross appointments at the School of Environment and the Munk School of Public Affairs. She holds a PhD in public policy from Princeton University and an MPA from Columbia University. Her research is centered on climate governance, including carbon markets, the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and near and dear to all of our hearts, green industrial policy. Her first book, Rethinking Private Authority, challenges the conventional wisdom that nation states are the only relevant actors in solving collective action problems. And I think that, this builds on work that she's published in Nature Climate Change, academic journals, New York Times, and now most recently with this book, Existential Politics, that all is kind of helping to give us a deeper, richer, more nuanced understanding of climate politics. So with that, I'll hand the baton over to Jessica. She's going to give about 15 minutes of remarks summarizing some of the main takeaways of the book. Then I'll engage in a couple of questions with her, and then we'll open up to the audience for about the last 25 minutes of our time together. So with that, it's my great honor to welcome Jessica Green to our book club.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks for that really kind introduction. I'm happy to be here today and to talk about my new book. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview. Some of you I know here, some of you have read parts of this book already, so please indulge me if I'm repeating some things. So this book was basically motivated by the fact that, in international relations and, even in the sort of public sphere, climate change has always been talked about as this collective action problem about mitigation. So how do we, we got to get everyone to act together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But obviously we have not made any progress on that, or very little progress on that, despite, almost 4 decades of multilateral cooperation. So for me, I was just started thinking, well, what if we're thinking about this problem in the wrong way? And it's not really a collective action problem about emissions mitigation, but rather a political contest between different types of asset owners. And that's how I define this concept of existential politics. And what existential politics means basically is that climate policy and the effects of climate change will revalue assets. So this is going to give rise to increasingly contentious political battles between asset owners, green asset owners, fossil asset owners, and vulnerable asset owners. And these aren't just distributional questions. I've described them as distributional problems on steroids, right? Because it's not just who wins and who loses, but which assets become worthless, which professions, which cultures, and even which nation states will survive. And so this is the basic idea of the book, is that we need to sort of rethink climate change not as this collective action problem about emissions mitigation, but rather as this conflict between types of asset owners. And the basic assumption is that all asset owners want to act in ways that will preserve the value of their assets for as long as possible. I think you can probably fill in the blanks a little bit about what falls into each category, but fossil asset owners are fossil fuel mining companies, heavy manufacturing, electric utilities that are fossil powered, banks that finance fossil assets, Green asset owners are renewable energy companies, producers of solar and wind components, EV producers, and so on and so forth. Vulnerable asset owners are a class that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. I sort of identify them in this stylized model of different types of asset owners, but also acknowledge that for a variety of reasons, politically, they haven't been very impactful in pushing decarbonization policy. So I'm going to just kind of table them for now. So if you buy this idea that climate change is a problem of existential politics, and that asset owners want to maintain the value of their assets or build the value of their assets, then there are two core political challenges. It's not to deter free riders and emissions mitigation, as we've basically designed in the Kyoto Protocol and to a lesser extent in the Paris Agreement, but rather to constrain the political power of fossil asset owners and their material power, and to build the breadth and scope and power of green asset owners. So, I mean, in some ways, this is not rocket science, right? A lot of people have said this, but our multilateral architecture does not map on to this mental model, right? Instead, what we've been doing for 4 decades in multilateral climate policy is what I call managing tons. And this is the narrow construction of climate change, as Todd was sort of mentioning in his introduction, as a problem of emissions mitigation, which is focused on measuring, accounting for, verifying, and trading tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And the problem with managing tons is that it takes all the politics out, and it leads to the false belief that cooperation on mitigation can produce rapid decarbonization. So if fossil asset owners really want to preserve the value of their assets, they're not going to cooperate. They are going to obstruct. And of course, we have a huge literature in social science that that shows the many, many ways in which fossil asset owners have been obstructing climate policy at multiple levels of governance. The book spends 3 chapters documenting in great detail, deep in the weeds, about the particulars of carbon accounting and why they don't work. And why they don't work in the sense that they have been captured by fossil asset owners and lulled us into this false belief that we are actually making progress on decarbonization. And so I look, the book, those chapters are centered around 3 policies, but kind of go more broadly. They are carbon offsets, my favorite, cap and trade schemes, and the concept of net zero used both by governments and also by firms. And it looks, sort of coincidentally at the EU carbon border adjustment tariff and the aviation agreement, other kinds of policies at the global level that rely on managing tons. And I show that, they really don't work. They assume that measurement and commodification will lead to climate solutions. They allow obstructionists to redirect their efforts towards counting emissions rather than reducing them. And they've produced this cottage industry, both in carbon markets and in net zero, of people who are very busy trying to do this. And they create a source of agreement amidst the gridlock, right? So they create ever more technical and complex policies that don't address the underlying political conflicts of existential politics. And to the extent that there is agreement and quote unquote progress, it further legitimates these approaches. So we're not going to solve the climate crisis through these technocratic approaches. So the second half of the book talks about what we should do instead. And the kind of the tagline there is dollars, not tons. And that if we really want to get a hold on existential politics, we need to focus on rerouting the flow of dollars in the global economy rather than tons of emissions in the atmosphere. And we have international institutions that can do that. So we need to think about these institutions, in particular tax, investment, and trade, although we'll talk about that, I think, in the discussion, tax, trade, and investment institutions as instruments of global climate policy. And they can do both things. They can help constrain the power of fossil asset owners and hopefully build up the power and breadth of green asset owners. And so I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to give you sort of a brief overview, I talk about how tax reform. Let me go back and say I consider all of the proposals that I put forth as what I call radical pragmatism. So that they're radical in the sense that they get to the root of the problem, which is asset revaluation and the existential politics it creates. But they're pragmatic in the sense that we don't have to remake the world order in order to put these in place. Now, I will say as a caveat that I submitted the book to the publisher in December of 2024, and obviously the world order has changed dramatically in the 9 months since then. But I still think that a lot of these arguments hold because we do have at least some vestiges of a liberal international order, and there are some things that are still functioning reasonably okay. So I look at 3 different kind of sets of institutions: tax reform, the investor state dispute settlement system, and trade policy in the form of green industrial policy. And tax reform basically talk about the OECD has these model rules that they put in place in 2021 that are actually being implemented. And they do many things. Some of you may know already about this. I learned a lot about international tax law. But one thing that they do is they implement a minimum corporate tax 15% on large multinational corporations. So corporations that I think it's 750 million euro or higher in revenue. And this is obviously important because, you know, tax evasion, tax arbitrage are huge problems. Tax havens are real, and the vagaries of the design are not important. But the upshot is that this is actually happening. It's really being implemented by countries, including the state, including the U.S. It obviously wants to do it a little bit differently because American exceptionalism. But the effective tax rate is close to the 15% that the model rules put forth. And it has its own, it has a sort of built-in enforcement mechanism, because any company that uses a subsidiary in another country will be, with a lower tax rate, will be subject to a top-up, which basically means that the parent company, the government of where the parent company is located gets to take some of that tax revenue back. So is this a panacea? No, but it would collect a lot of money, hundreds of billions, between I think 150 and 250 billion per year in additional revenue, which countries can use however they want. And even if they don't use it for the purposes of green infrastructure or green industrial policy, it will still take money away from firmly entrenched fossil asset interests. The second is the investor state dispute settlement system, which is an private arbitration system to govern, basically protect foreign investment from arbitrary regulation or expropriation by host governments. These are trade provisions that are used in over 2,600 bilateral and multilateral investment treaties. And there's a lot of research that's not my own, mostly by Kaila Tianhara and her team, that looks at how this has protected the fossil asset industry, fossil asset owners, mostly oil and gas, but mining too. And what it does is it basically, these firms have been suing governments, saying that, you know, their climate regulations or some, you know, other types of regulations are hurting their investments. And so they end up paying out hundreds of millions of dollars to fossil asset owners, which obviously it does not serve climate goals at all. And so this approach is basically, we need to stop using, there was a big effort a few years ago to try and reform the ISDS. It didn't really work. But what is a much simpler solution is that countries can simply opt out of that and not use it in their trade agreements. And there are some countries that are actually doing that. And then finally, and I think this is probably the piece we'll talk about the most in the Q&A, is trade policy or green industrial policy. And, you know, obviously, I have a feeling that I'm talking to people who know a lot more about green industrial policy than I do. There's no sort of one size fits all. I think there are some principles that can govern how to do green industrial policy. And in particular, I will just highlight two here. One is kind of this what I think of as sort of Goldilocks policy, where you want a little bit of protectionism because that's going to help build, you know, at the domestic level, because that will help build domestic constituencies in support of decarbonization policy, but not too much that it completely slows the diffusion of technologies that have been scaled, like cough, cough, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. And so again, there's not like one way to go about doing this, but there is a balance here. And I think as a political scientist, what I'm trying to kind of bring attention to is the fact that these kinds of radical pragmatist measures are not an end in and of themselves, but what they can do is try to disembed the power, the material, economic, and political power of fossil asset owners and build up that of green asset owners in ways that hopefully sets off kind of positive feedback cycles, which have been sort of theorized and to a lesser extent documented by other political scientists. So I guess just to conclude, because I'm almost at my 15 minutes, the three big, I think, takeaways from the book here are that existential politics means we can't cooperate with fossil asset owners to address the climate crisis. And we need to disabuse ourselves of that. And that may seem very obvious to people in the room, but if you look at the last 4 decades of climate policy at the multilateral level, that we have not disabused ourselves of that notion. Second, the policies that we do have, managing tons, really don't address this fundamental conflict between different types of asset owners. And so what we need to do is think about how to use the existing institutions that we have that manage dollars in the global economy as instruments to get greater leverage on this power asymmetry between different types of asset owners. Okay, thanks very much.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this talk and really enjoyed getting to read the book as well and see it develop over the course of a few months and years. I think that you said it early on in your remarks that there's always these complications with publishing a big sort of idea book about where do we go from here, and then have to submit it for publication, and then a bunch of stuff happens in the interim between publication and writing it. And I think several of my questions are just actually kind of focused on that, based on sort of, what in sort of this post-Trump environment, where so many of the parameters that we seem to be dealing with have been changing, if and how that's affected your thinking sort of after the book was sent to press. And I think I would start with just kind of one question related more to problem diagnosis, which is, I think you make a compelling case, as have like folks like Kate Aronoff or Naomi Klein or others, that the fossil fuel industry is not to be trusted, not to be cooperated with, that because it is in their economic interest to continue producing, that they can't be a part of the climate solution. And I think I tend to agree with that. However, I think that since the election in the US, and I'll sort of be a little bit parochial here. I know you're based in Canada and you're an international relations professor who thinks a lot about, a lot of different parts of the world. But I think at least from the perspective of the US context, I feel like a real climate malaise has set in since the election. You saw this with, David Wallace's Wells piece in the New York Times a week or two ago, where it's like, is the world giving up on even trying to do anything about climate change? You have these different sort of emerging schools of thought within the U.S., like the climate realism movement that the Council on Foreign Relations is pushing. That's basically like, the US shouldn't even worry about trying to address its own emissions because the whole story is outside of the country, and we just need to develop geopolitical means of coercing other countries to reduce their emissions. You have this sort of abundance or sort of affordability lens that is becoming, more influential, that, basically, depending on, who you're talking to, and there was a poll that was put out by the New Searchlight Institute last week that sort of says we shouldn't even be talking about climate change because it either scares people too much or it doesn't do anything to move the needle on climate ambition. And we need to kind of just basically disguise what we're trying to do on climate in the lens of, other anti-inflation policies or sort of other types of policies. So, I mean, that's a lot of kind of landscape there. But I guess if we are in a world, at least in the US context, where we're moving back to kind of all of the above energy solutions being sort of like where the direction of travel seems to be going, does it make sense to sort of think in terms back away from sort of like these fundamental binaries between sort of fossil and clean energy capital, and in fact just try to get, and this is sort of a contrarian point for the sake of argument, but like, does it make sense to try to just have the fossil companies shift more of their portfolio towards clean than to try to think that we have the political muscle to effectively eliminate them?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So I'm going to give you a couple of different answers. I think on the one hand, sure, let's do all of the above, because in the short term, we need as much reduction as quickly, as much as we can get, right? Every 1/10 of a degree matters. And there are some policies that might maybe not in the US because of the political polarization around the issue, but in other countries, making money cheaper for renewable energy investments, for starters. So yes, I think that is a reasonable approach, but it's not going to get us to decarbonization, right? Because we know that this is companies that hedge, basically you get to a threshold, right? And in order to have a systemic transformation, you got to get over that hump, right? Otherwise, what we're doing is sort of monkeying at the margins, and we're making efficiency improvements. Maybe we're doing some fuel switching, but we're not actually decarbonizing. So, I mean, I don't think that is that's kind of harm reduction in the short term. I don't think that it's a lasting solution. And, my worry is, and this is kind of like what we're seeing in Canada, is that what happens then is you actually do start investing in more fossil assets, right? So like there's talk about more CCS, pipelines, LNG, like all this dumb stuff. I mean, not dumb, but, economically really bad and climatically really bad stuff. So I think that there's pretty strong arguments that slippery slope will continue the lock-in problem for even longer.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. To maybe flip to the other side, from sort of problem diagnosis to solutions, and this kind of goes in the complete opposite direction of my first question, but in a sense, like, I think that your take on what a radical pragmatist view, set of options would be, makes a lot of sense from like the vantage point of 2024 and, a second Biden administration or first Kamala Harris administration. I think that, redoubling efforts on the global tax treaty, really getting to some sort of forward-looking vision on how trade and investment treaties can be used, continuing the progress that was already made on green industrial policy. I think all of that, is both sort of radical and pragmatist. Like, I agree with the sort of your framing in the book. I guess I wonder, from like thinking ahead, we're doing a lot of thinking at Roosevelt about 2029, sort of like the next potential governing moment, right? And I think that, if I try to anticipate what the state of the world is going to be, especially as it relates to sort of those three solutions that you're talking about, I mean, first of all, it's hard to imagine exactly where we'll be, first of all. But I mean, I think that there's also, it's plausible that we won't have much left in the way of international trade architecture that like we can repurpose, for sort of more progressive ends. I don't know where we'll be on taxes. I mean, I think that, already we saw how Trump used the threat of tariffs to, effectively get Mark Carney to back off of the idea of doing digital taxes, at least for now. And so I just kind of wonder, if we try to imagine a little bit ahead. Well, and I guess the other thing I would just kind of mention on green industrial policy is that, you and I have talked about this a lot over the years, but there was a theory of change kind of embedded in Bidenomics that there would be, as you mentioned, sort of policy feedback from making these green industrial policy investments. The idea is that's going to create jobs in the ground. That's going to create new constituencies that are invested in climate action and want to kind of see it keep going forward. I think that the experience of the last few months, I feel like that there's some things on the ledger of that theory of change making sense and some things that suggest it might not, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, I was encouraged to see in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or as I like to call it, the second biggest piece of climate legislation ever passed in the US. And I say that because, basically for a lot of sectors like geothermal and, clean hydrogen and a bunch of different sectors, those industries successfully mobilized to keep their tax credits and benefits intact and convinced Republicans on a party line vote to actually support that stuff, which has not been widely reported, but I think is an important part of the story. On the other hand, obviously, and this is where I think most takes on the One Big Beautiful Bill have landed, is that it really does a lot of damage to solar, wind, and electric vehicles, for starters. And I think that moreover, we're just in a context where there's a lot of state capacity being shred in general to sort of keep these things moving. So I guess it's just, all that's a lot of scene setting, but like, if you were try to sort of think ahead a few years down the line, would where your sort of median radical pragmatist solution be different than it maybe would have been in 2024? And are there any new tactics that you think might make sense in that scenario?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea that we're only 8 months into the Trump presidency, right, and we have another like 3.5 to go. It's just 2029 is about 4 centuries away, according to that calculus. But I guess so. The optimistic way to look at this, which is also the optimistic way to think about kind of um, firms hedging versus a sort of faster rollout of green technology, is a kind of punctuated equilibrium, right? We've had this kind of fairly stable liberal international order, basically run by the winners for a long time. It's getting blown up, and something is going to replace it. We don't know what it's going to be, and none of us has a crystal ball. But in the mix of that is, I think, a real fear and, sort of bolstered by racism about the rise of China, and, how that is changing this kind of geopolitical order. And I think that could actually be the catalyst for reorganizing trade and other forms of international cooperation at the regional level or with different kinds of trading partners, and that middle powers are really going to be faced with a decision right now about how they're going to align themselves. Are they going to, there's been talked about this sort of bifurcation between petrostates and electrostates, and like a ecological cold war, as Niles Gilman put it. So I think that there is actually there is potential for that median radical pragmatist approach to be not that different if there are some countries that sort of find each other in the chaos here and make a decision based more, I would say, on economics and trade relations than climate, to kind of move ahead with cooperative efforts. And some of those could be about how we decommission fossil assets and create new ones. But either way, I think that a key point here is that whatever happens, there's going to have to be a more muscular version of the state. And that is in contravention to, decades of the Washington Consensus and everything else. And the question is sort of what, if anything, will catalyze the realization or the decision from policymakers, particularly in OECD countries that are large emitters, that they need to do this. Is it going to be sort of climate catastrophe? Is it going to be social unrest? Is it going to be actual response to voter concerns, or something else that we haven't anticipated yet? So I think the optimist would say, the chaos right now is frightening, but it also provides an opportunity for real reorientation in ways that could be potentially quite beneficial, because you're kind of just crafting new coalitions of the willing among countries with considerable capacity and hopefully state will, political will.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'd love to see sort of some, development of kind of outside of the US coalitions developing to take action here. I think, we do see it in certain spaces. There has been some experiments with trade agreements that, involve kind of high ambition countries on climate, including strong climate ambition. So I hopefully that will happen. And hopefully there's also stuff at the sub-federal level in the US that can be kind of moving the ball forward. Everybody that's on the club should ready your questions, because I'll turn to you in another couple of minutes here to weigh in with your own questions for Jessica about her book or otherwise. But I guess I would just ask to zoom back a little bit to the sort of problem definition questions. I think that you paint a story of the managing tons approach as a story, a little bit of a public choice story in some ways of government sort of being captured by fossil fuel to do things that are not fundamentally transformative. Could you just say a little bit more about kind of how you think that that government role involved? I mean, because I guess there's another interpretation could be, is a managing tons approach more in keeping with how governments think of what their own appropriate role is in public policy, where they can do measurement, they can set standards, they can do regulation, but they're not sort of in the, I think and this may change in the years to come, but they don't, I mean, generally most Western governments don't see themselves sort of in the expropriation or effectively expropriation business, as someone who's written a lot about expropriation myself. But just kind of wondering if why is that wrong? Why is the idea that government sort of playing this kind of measurement and more regulatory role is not adequate?
So I don't think it's inherently wrong, and I think you're right. That's what governments do, right? They measure stuff. They're bean counters, right? But what I show is that the politics of measurement are such that these are not, they are subject to capture, and they are not easily reformed. And so I think we can, the conversation should be, what else can we measure? Right? And there's a lot of discussion in the book about why measuring dollars is a lot better than measuring tons. Governments know how to do that. They know how to levy taxes. They know how to detect non-compliance, tax evasion, right? They have a lot more experience in that than they do with measuring emissions. So I don't think it started that way. I mean, and if you look at the history of a lot of the sort of various policies that I examine, carbon pricing, offsets, and net zero, they all came from, let's put it this way, people who were not necessarily attuned to the politics of measurement. So they weren't kind of, tapped into the ideas of, or the possibilities of how this could go very wrong. And so I just think that, we need to keep that in mind. Offsets are, people selling hypothetical amounts of non-existent carbon, which is just bonkers. I mean, we do have collateralized debt obligations, so I guess it's not that bonkers, but you know, at least dollars are a thing that we can measure. We know what they are. We know how to track them in ways that are much more reliable than measuring tons. So yeah, governments have to measure things, but they could pick better things to measure, I think, for sure.
Yeah, less speculative. Yeah, and we're still living with the fallout from collateralized debt obligations and their effect on the financial system. All right, folks. So we'll open it up. I mean, as you'll see, this is kind of an open Zoom, so it's more of a you know, a meeting rather than, you know, a seminar. So folks should raise their hand. You can feel free to drop questions in the chat or the Q&A, or you can just raise your hand and you can come off video or come off of mute and ask your question or make a comment, you know, about what you've been hearing today. So the floor is open. Noah Gordon from Carnegie Endowment. Yes, if folks could actually just say a little bit about your point of entry into this conversation, either professional affiliation or other interest, and then make your comment or your question.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Jessica. Todd, you introduced me. Jessica, big fan of your work. I mean, since the 2020 paper, Existential Politics, and before. And you have a good section. Looking forward to reading the book. You have a good section in that paper where you talk about this being a spectrum and the actors who can move between categories of climate forcing and vulnerable. Todd spoke to this a little bit, but maybe if you could elaborate on how actors move between categories, or have you seen that happen with a company that is now moves from one side to the other or produces more EVs or something along those lines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Like, that's where the action is, right? And you know, I think here I will shout out Jonas Namanau's Kupsak's work on decarbonizable industries, and sort of the idea that there are some industries that are easier to convert just because the technology is there, like power in the automotive sector. But there's not a huge amount of work on how this actually happens. I'll say two things. One, there's not a huge amount of work on how this actually happens. And some of the comparativists have found that there's actually variation within industry based on like, you know, corporatist relations and level of unionization and things like that. So this is I mean, as Todd knows better than me, like, this is the tricky thing about green industrial policy, right? Is that there's no one size fits all. It depends so much on the capabilities and institutions of individual sectors and individual countries. So that's one thing that I would say. And then what was the other thing that I was going to say about flipping it? Oh, right. So I think in the book, one way that I try to think about this is, what are the strategies that sectors or individual, if you were to look, you know, below the kind of macro arguments that I make at the sectoral or even the firm level, what are the strategies that individual actors or sectors use? And I look at, you know, I sort of think about four: decarbonize, hedge, obstruct, and so another one that I can't think of at the moment. And so I think that we get really, and the argument is that we really we get distracted by the hedgers, and we really need to look at who's actually decarbonizing and who's actually obstructing. And so there may be some actors who are trying to transition, but the kind of the proof is in the pudding about what they're actually doing vis-a-vis climate policy. And again, the unit of analysis is pretty important, right? Because from a political science perspective, like, individual firms sometimes act differently, even if in the same sector, even in the same country, because some of them have subsidiary, you know, some of them have spin-off or subsidiaries that do renewables, and then they have part that does fossil. So it's very hard to I know that's a kind of mealy-mouthed answer, but it's difficult to make any generalizations about that, except for to say the proof is in the pudding of like what their actual strategies are. Oh, you're muted, Todd.
Thanks for that, Noah. Danny, we'll put you in here.
Thank you so much. And I have the book, haven't read it. It's been a delight following your work over the years, Jess. I'm going to take the invitation to offer a comment rather than a question because it's all I got. I spend all day counting carbon, and there is no better indictment of my horrible life choices than I think the very profound insight you've raised about how easy it is to capture accounting processes for counting tons. And I just commend everybody else on the call. That is, I think, probably the most important insight I've come across in several years. And I now view almost everything I do as rearguard action. And you tell me what to do next because I'm out of ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny, and big shout out to Danny who talked me through a lot of tricky bits of the book. So thank you for that, those kind words. Who's next?
Katarina, why don't you get it?
Hi, Todd. Hi, Jessica. I'm the CFO at the Institute. I didn't read the book, but I was listening to the discussion. What I had not heard, maybe I missed it, is the role of insurance companies in the debates that we're having right now. I mean, we've talked about as an institute, we were hoping, I think, that insurance companies will play a larger role in trying to combat climate change because they are probably the most right now impacted at the cost of that. I'm talking mostly United States. I don't know how the insurance market works in other countries. But is that something that you see? I mean, is it maybe something that's happening behind the scenes? Is there any influence that you're seeing from them, or are they being silenced like everybody else? We're not supposed to talk about climate change, just Todd said. So sorry if it's kind of outside of the scope of the book, but it's just my personal kind of curiosity because as a CFO, I deal with risks and pricing it and whatnot. So hope you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, insurance companies are, sort of front and center here, right? They're, I think, the most, so in the book, I say they're these climate vulnerable asset owners. Often they're homeowners or even government, owners of infrastructure. But I say that they're not generally an important political force because they're not organized in the same way. They're not concentrated in the same way. But the exception is the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry. And, they've been yelling sort of louder and louder, but I think part of the issue is, and I don't follow this too much, but I think part of the issue is that, ultimately in wealthy countries, most of the time, the government is the insurer of last resort. So that they are, climate vulnerable asset owners, but only to a point. So, I mean, obviously that's not a great business model for them. I think that they are advocating for, more protections, but when, I know the United States is probably the case that I know the best, the nexus between homeowners, banks, and insurance companies. Like when the bottom falls out of the insurance industry, the economy is cooked. Like really, it is a real sensitive point I mean, cooked. That might be an overstatement, but is a hugely sensitive point in the economy. And so you would, the theory would dictate that there would be probably more action at the national level. But we, at least in the U.S., it's been superseded by the climate denialism and all the rest of it of the Trump administration. So I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle, but and how it interacts with other asset owners, I think, is probably the most important piece.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to jump in here? You can just come off a video or raise your hand.
Hi,
Alex.
Jessica. Hey, Todd. Thanks. I work for the Roosevelt Network, which is like the branch of the Roosevelt Institute that organizes college students who are interested in a career in public policy. And one of the things that we do a lot at Roosevelt is take big, dense ideas and try to package them in a way that they feel relatable to the undergraduate mind and mindset. And as you were talking, I think, like, as I was trying to reach around my own life, probably one of the only ways that this would feel relatable to kind of your everyday human might be that checkbox that I do when I buy a ticket for a flight. And it says, do you want to, add however many cents for the carbon offset? And I'm just wondering about, like, if that's just what I reached for first, but just for like this kind of big, broad umbrella of discussion, like, what's the kind of sneaky backdoor in conversationally with people in your everyday life who might hear, you know, firm level versus international level, and their eyes glaze over, but like, what's the back door into kind of caring even if you don't get it?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to push on the offsets thing, I have friends who are like, should I buy these offsets? And I'm like, no, you should not, because they're BS. I think there's a couple ways, like, I think about how I think to, how I speak with my students. One is like, going back to the offsets, don't buy them, but also imagine how, like, you would think about your carbon footprint, even though I have big issues with that, if there was no such thing as offsets, like, or how you would think about, the US's emissions or whomever, like, if there were no such thing as offsets. Like, what if we couldn't buy our way out of this? How would you think about this differently? I think is one. And then the other way is, I think this has changed over the years of my teaching students, but, I remember, and it's still the case, that like students really wanted to, make change from the inside, and they would go and work in corporate, social responsibility, or consulting firms, or even like the ESG arm of, big fossil asset companies. And, I think that's another way that, young people can think about how they engage with climate, is like, what do they want to be when they grow up? Like, do they want to, I think you do have to sort of, I know this is very antithetical perhaps to the Roosevelt Institute mandate, but I think you do have to pick sides. I tell my students to think about, like, well, what do you think is important? What do you think, what is your theory of change? Like, how do you think you're going to make, how might you make a difference in the world? How would you do that? And to just engage with that question. So many students of mine have not. So I think that's a way to sort of think about it. That's, much more kind of quotidian than this bigger sort of set of theory about asset owners. I hope that helps.
All right. I see someone logging in from my account, Todd Tucker, who is not me. So why don't the other Todd Tucker chime in?
You have a doppelganger, a
No,
ghost
not.
doppelganger.
I know that I shared my link with someone.
Sorry, I'm on my phone and I can't, it's really difficult to get to the unmute button. Hi, thank you. This is Heather Boucher, and Todd had emailed this to me over the weekend. Jessica, this was a really super interesting talk. Thank you so much. I'm excited to take a look at the book. And I wanted to and maybe this is a little bit, this is riffing off of the conversation about measurement. I spent my time in the Biden administration trying to working with, but trying to figure out how we can rethink our macroeconomic models to incorporate climate damages and the risks and opportunities of transitioning to a clean energy economy. And this question of, as an economist, I'm always thinking about what we measure and how that really defines what we think the economy is. Our inability to, tabulate damages in a way that makes sense, our inability to understand, like, in a dynamic way, competitiveness over the next 20 to 30 years, based on whether we do or do not develop clean energy technologies here in the United States. Like, everywhere you turn, there were these really big questions around how we are measuring the economy, the ways that our models right now are far too static. And I'm just curious because I haven't read your book and you didn't mention it. So maybe you're like, I didn't think about this at all. But I was curious if any of those questions came up for you and if you have any thoughts on them, because I think that they are pretty germane to how central bankers and fiscal policy, ministries of finance need to be thinking about these issues.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I've thought about it in the sense of like, yeah, this, as I, said to Todd before in answer to his question, like dollars is something that we have a better sort of handle on as, or policymakers and governments have a better handle on. I think, I guess I will, but it is challenging in the sense that how you define things really matters, obviously. And here I'm thinking about like the sort of real challenges in climate finance, which is like a constant conversation at the multilateral level, but still there's no accepted definition of what that is. And so I guess I haven't thought about the mechanics of it. I think sort of more about it in terms of geopolitics, and there I guess the rough proxy is market share, right? This is which is obviously a dynamic thing, both market share for green technologies and for different links in the supply chain. So not just the finished product, but all of the inputs as well. I think that's where kind of a lot of the conversation is going now in terms of how do we measure sort of our prospects for decarbonization and for economic competition going forward. But I haven't thought about that as much probably as you have.
Well, thank you. That was still a great answer. I really do look forward to reading the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather.
All right, we have another Heather Walters.
Hi, new to the space here, but I'm with the California State Senate. I work in the Environmental Quality Committee, so we cover a lot of state level legislation in the space of how to transition between the fossil assets and the green ones. I think working at the state level, we in some ways have a expanded scope of options in terms of what we can do, but a narrowed scope in terms of the impact that those can really have. So, obviously, I think a lot of the international trade stuff that you've talked about is out of reach for us, but I think this sort of political battle underway here of there being these entrenched assets with tremendous power and then the new world struggling to be born. Ordered the book, really looking forward to reading it, but are there any sort of, I guess, outside of the scope of what you've discussed already, any sort of accessory policies? Like how can as a state entity, we take any steps towards not even leveling the playing field, but like stopping fossil assets from just smothering the political power of green assets in the cradle? Like it's kind of this chicken egg thing of before they have the power to really, affect the policymakers. How do we get that first bit of power? Any thoughts you have on the matter, I will actively try and push us into doing so. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It's a really important one. I guess I have thought about this. I guess in the context of part of the motivation for a lot of this thinking is just we need another way to brand climate, like going along with what Todd said about the David Wallace Wells piece and the climate realists saying like we can't talk about climate anymore. Everybody's sick of climate. We can talk about other things. We can talk about competitiveness. We can talk about economic policy. We can talk about disaster preparedness, and we can also talk about, I think, this is one of my little sort of pet ideas. Well, it's not my idea, but investments in the service economy and the care economy, right? So we are facing crises, certainly in Canada, and I know in the States as well, in the healthcare sector, in the elder care sector, in the teaching sector, that these are all places that require, investments that will help people understand that climate policy is a lot more than just tons, right? That these kinds of investments in the state, in the social safety net, they are actually related to climate, right? Because they are low emissions activities. They are sort of awakening the musculature of the state to intervene, which is a thing that it will need to do in whatever capacity it chooses to implement decarbonization policy. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I would say, is that, you know, there has to be more, you know, and talk to Danny Cullenward and fix the carbon cap, the California cap and trade scheme, because it's very broken.
One of my favorite pastimes. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, so we're about at time, but I want to, if you could join me in a round of virtual applause for Jessica here. This was a lot of fun, and best of luck getting this out, you know, published, and sort of the rest of the book talks that you have to give. We really appreciate your time today. For folks that are joining us, we will do more of these book clubs in the future. So stay tuned to your email and to various social medias to see what we have next in store. But really glad you could all make it today, and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Todd.
you. Great job.
Bye.